Hi, this is Dan Heisman, Philly tutor for Chess FM. And this is the Improve Your Chess video series for ICC members. In today's game, we're going to look at a game between two 1800 players played at a 95 rate, I believe. And you have an interesting opening, so let's get right to it. White played e4, black replied e6, French defense. White plays d4, black plays d5, and now white has four main continuations: knight c3 classical, knight d2 terrace, e5 advanced, and e takes d5 exchange. White decides to play the most popular move, knight c3. And now there's three big moves. The three big moves are bishop to b4 winnower, knight f6 classical, and d takes e5, which can be kind of a Rubinstein-Bern kind of variation, which could transpose into other rarer lines. Okay. So here, black plays a fairly rare move, and he plays it very quickly, so obviously he's booked up on this. He plays knight c6. Knight c6 is, quite off the beaten path here, but it's not a terrible move. It blocks black's break move, but the center is not locked yet. White, of course, has a choice to lock the center, but in which case white is also blocking his c-pawn. Now let's compare this with a line in the terrace. If white had played knight to d2 terrace, then the main lines are c5 and knight f6, but there's quite a few secondary lines. Of course, you can transpose into the Rubinstein again with d takes e4. But here, black can play knight c6, and that's called the Guimard variation. And the Guimard variation has a, so-so reputation, but it is played by some decent players. But yet, the Guimard variation is played a lot more than the line knight c6 that was played in the game after knight c3. So as an experiment, I gave the two positions to Stockfish. I let him think for a while, quite a while in fact, after knight c6 in the game, and I let him think for a while with the Guimard without his opening book. And after a long think, basically the computer said that white's advantage in the Guimard was only a tenth of a pawn less than it was in the knight c6, knight c3, knight c6 line. And that means that the one-tenth of a pawn was enough to make the difference between a line that was, played but not the most popular versus a line that's almost never seen. And that shows you the very, very small difference in chess between playing the mainline book moves and playing other moves that might be reasonable toward your development. So let's get back to the game. So even though black's move is rated slightly less than the Guimard in the terrace, it has the advantage that it's so little known that it's almost impossible that your opponent as white would know something about this line. All right, well, the obvious move here for white is to keep the flexibility in the position and play knight on 1 to f3. The whole idea of knight on 1 to f3 is very simple. If black opens the center, so he doesn't have to worry as much maybe about the break move. Now, when black does that, this pawn is guarded twice and it's safe. So, in a sense, black has a threat here. He's threatening to take the e-pawn and then play queen takes d4, winning the pawn. And white has to meet that threat in some way. And knight f3 is the most flexible move. In the game, white did think for a while. He thought for about the right amount of time. He thought for about a minute and a half, which you can't do too much more in a 95 game. And he decided to save the pawn by pushing it, hoping to punish black for blocking the break move. And of course, black was probably prepared for this. And he played f6, but he didn't play it immediately. He took a couple minutes, so maybe he was out of his book too. All right, well, now the game continues somewhat logically. Knight f3 to reguard that square. Bishop b4, developing the bishop and putting some pressure in the center. White plays bishop d3. Black takes the pawn in the center to try to trade a side pawn for the center pawn. And white